There's a comment that keeps showing up on the Pattern Weaver videos, and I want to read it back to you because if you're watching this, you've probably written some version of it yourself. It usually sounds like this. I have unfinished songs, unfinished books, unfinished degrees. I feel like a loser. I feel like a dysfunctional human being. I love that I'm curious about everything, but I cannot stand the graveyard I've built behind me. I read these and I want to tell you something very directly because it's the most important thing in this video. The graveyard is not the problem. The definition of finished you've been handed is the problem. Every pattern weaver I've ever met carries the same wound. They were trained by school, by parents, by an entire culture to believe that a project has exactly two possible end states. Either you complete the artifact, in which case you're allowed to feel okay about it, or you don't, in which case you carry the guilt for the rest of your life. The half-finished book sits on the shelf and stares at you every morning. The abandoned course haunts you every time you open your laptop. The song that never got mixed makes you feel like a fraud every time someone asks what you've made lately. I'm going to free you from this in the next 20 minutes. Not with another pep talk about how you're allowed to be scattered. You already know that. You've watched the other videos. You've been told you're a pattern weaver. That hasn't been enough. Because every time you walk past the graveyard, the guilt still wins. What I'm going to give you instead is a framework. A practical one. Something you can use this week to look at every abandoned project in your life and reclassify it correctly. Because here is what nobody told you. Most of the projects you think you abandoned weren't actually abandoned. They were finished. In a way that your old definition of finished couldn't see. I call this the finisher's framework. It rests on one single move, and once you make this move, the graveyard becomes a workshop. The move is this. There are not two kinds of finish. There are four, and the reason you feel like a failure is that you've been measuring all of your projects against the wrong one. Let me walk you through all four. By the end, you're going to do an audit of your own life, and I promise you the geography of your guilt is going to look very different. The first finish line is the concept finish. This is the one almost every pattern weaver misses, and it accounts for a staggering amount of the guilt you carry. Here is what a concept finish looks like. You picked up a topic. Maybe it was Stoic philosophy? Maybe it was woodworking. Maybe it was machine learning. You went deep enough to extract the core mental model. You learned how Stoics actually think about control. You learned why a dovetail joint is stronger than a screw. You learned what a transformer architecture actually does. And then, mysteriously, your interest evaporated and you walked away. Your old narrative says you quit. The concept finish says you finished. The artifact, the actual thing you thought you were trying to build, was never the point. The point was the mental model. The point was the thread. And the moment that thread entered your loom, the project completed itself. Your brain knew, even if you didn't, that you had what you came for. The boredom you felt afterward was not laziness. It was your nervous system telling you the work was done. Test it on yourself. Think of one abandoned topic from the past 5 years. Ask yourself, do I now have a working mental model of how that field thinks? If the answer is yes, that project is not in your graveyard. It is on your loom. It is, in the most important sense, finished. I'd argue that maybe 60% of what pattern weavers call abandoned projects are actually concept finishes that nobody gave them permission to count. Today, I'm giving you permission. Count them. The second finish line is the shelf finish. This is for projects that are not done, but also not dead, and you need a way to keep them alive without the guilt of constantly seeing them as unfinished. Here is the move. Instead of leaving a project in the limbo of, I should really get back to this someday, you consciously and deliberately shelve it. The act of shelving is not abandonment. It is the polymath equivalent of a professional pause. Imagine an actual shelf in your mind. Or better, build one in the real world. A folder on your computer. A notebook section. A literal shelf in your home labeled the curiosity shelf. When a project loses its heat, you don't grind through it out of obligation, and you don't drop it on the floor and pretend it never happened. You shelve it and you write a tag on it. 3 things go on the tag. The first thing is what you got out of it so far. What threads did this project add to your loom? What threads did this project add to your loom, even in its incomplete form? Write them down. The second thing is, what conditions would bring you back? Maybe you'll come back to this song when you finally have a decent microphone. Maybe you'll come back to this novel when you've lived a little more. Maybe you'll come back to this course when a project actually requires it. Name the trigger. The third thing is a one-line note to your future self. What did you learn about your own process while doing this? What would you do differently if and when you return? That shelf, properly maintained, is one of the most powerful tools a pattern weaver can build. Because this is the part no one warns you about. Pattern weavers come back to old shelved projects all the time, often years later, and the second pass is often the one that produces real work. The first pass was for learning. The shelf was for ripening. The second pass is for finishing. Brian May, who I talked about in the last video, shelved his astrophysics PhD for 30 years to be a rock star, and then came back and finished it. That was not a failure of focus. That was a 30-year shelf finish, and it worked. A shelved project is not in your graveyard. It is in your greenhouse. It is doing something even when you're not looking at it. The third finish line is the synthesis finish, and this one, in my opinion, is the most important move a pattern weaver can learn. Here's the idea. Some of your unfinished projects were never meant to be finished on their own. They were meant to be finished together. Let me give you an example. Imagine you spent 6 months obsessing over behavioral economics and never wrote anything about it. You feel guilty. Then you spent 4 months obsessing over interior design and never built anything. You feel guilty. Then you spent 3 months learning the basics of small business operations and never started a business. You feel guilty. Now look at those 3 threads sitting on your loom. Behavioral economics, interior design, small business operations. What does the pattern weaver see that the specialist doesn't? They see a consulting practice that helps small retail businesses redesign their physical spaces using behavioral science to increase customer dwell time and conversion. That is not 3 abandoned projects. That is one beautiful, integrated, monetizable project that could only have been built by someone who held all 3 threads at once. This is the synthesis finish. You take 3 or 4 incomplete projects and you ask, what can I build that only somebody with this exact combination could build? I cannot overstate how often this works. The reason pattern weavers feel like dabblers is that they keep evaluating their projects one at a time, in isolation, against the standards of the specialist who would have built each one alone. But you were never going to be the world's best behavioral economist. You were never going to be the world's best interior designer. You were never going to be the world's best small business operator. What you can be, what nobody else can be, is the only person in your city offering that specific intersection. The synthesis finish has a practical move attached to it. Once a quarter, sit down and look at every thread on your loom. Every shelved project, every concept you've extracted, every interest you've explored in the past 2 or 3 years. Lay them all out on a single page. Then ask one question. What 3 of these woven together would make something the world doesn't have yet? You'll find at least one combination per quarter that lights you up. Maybe 2. That combination, that synthesis, is your next real project. Not a 4th new interest. Not abandoning the old ones. A weaving of what's already on your loom. This is how pattern weavers actually build businesses. They don't pick a niche. They notice an intersection. The intersection was already in their head. They just had to give themselves permission to see it. The 4th finish line is the one most people are familiar with, and the one we'll spend the least time on. I call it the artifact finish. This is the traditional definition of done. You completed the thing. The book is written. The song is mixed. The course is launched. The product exists in the world and other people can touch it. I'm not going to tell you artifact finishes don't matter. They do. They matter a great deal. They are the only finish that the outside world can directly see, and they are how pattern weavers convert their inner weaving into outer income. But here is the trap. If you measure yourself only by artifact finishes, you will be miserable because pattern weavers, by their nature, will always have a ratio of about 10 to 1 between threads explored and artifacts shipped. 9 out of 10 projects will end as concept finishes, shelf finishes, or syntheses. Only about 1 in 10 will become an artifact in the world. That is not a flaw. That is the math of how pattern weavers create value. The 10 concept finishes are what give the one artifact its unique flavor. The synthesis is what makes the artifact unrepeatable by anyone else. The shelf is where the next artifact is quietly ripening. So the move with artifact finishes is not to do more of them. It is to be intentional about which one you choose to ship. Ideally, the artifact you commit to actually shipping is itself a synthesis finish. You're not picking one of your threads and trying to grind it to completion. You're picking the intersection of several threads and shipping that. That is where pattern weavers do their best, most distinctive work. It is also where the world has the least competition for them. So the framework is 4 finish lines. Concept. Shelf. The synthesis phase. Artifact. Let me bring them together for you, because I want you to walk away from this video with something you can actually do this week. Here is the exercise. Find an hour, find a quiet room, and bring a notebook. I want you to do what I call a Loom Audit. Make 4 columns on a piece of paper. Label them concept, shelf, synthesis, and artifact. Then list every abandoned project from the past 3 to 5 years that still makes you feel guilty when you think about it. Every half-finished book. Every dropped course. Every started and stopped business idea. Every unfinished creative project. Everything mentioned. Then go through the list one item at a time and ask, which of these 4 finish lines did this project actually cross? For each item, do this. First, ask if you extracted the core mental model. If yes, mark it Concept Finished. Stop feeling guilty. That project is on your loom. It served its purpose. If no, ask whether you genuinely come back to it if circumstances changed. If yes, move it to the shelf. I can't tell what the 3 tags you mentioned earlier are. Now it's not in your graveyard. It's in your greenhouse. If no, ask if this thread might combine with 2 or 3 others on your list into a single coherent project. If yes, draw lines connecting them and write down what the combination could be. That's a synthesis candidate. Keep that page somewhere visible. If none of the above apply and the project is truly dead, write it in a 5th column called Released. Acknowledge it. Thank it. Move on. Some projects do simply end, and that is also fine. By the end of this exercise, I promise you something. The graveyard you've been carrying around in your chest is going to look very different. Most of it is going to relocate to your loom, your greenhouse, or your synthesis page. The actual graveyard, the truly dead pile, is going to be much smaller than you feared. I've done this exercise myself. I've watched dozens of pattern weavers do it. The number one reaction is always the same. I'm not actually behind. I just didn't have the right map. That map is the finisher's framework. Keep it close. Run the audit at least once a year. Some pattern weavers do it quarterly. Some put it on their birthday. Now, before I let you go, I want to leave you with one harder truth. Because if I gave you only the 4 finish lines without this part, the framework would be incomplete. The truth is this. Pattern weavers need at least 1 artifact finish per year. Not 3. Not 7. 1. You need at least 1 thing per year that exists in the world. A book. An essay. A product. A song that got mixed. A piece of art that left your hard drive. A talk that you actually gave. A business that took at least 1 paying customer. Because the concept finishes feed your loom, the shelf finishes feed your future, and the syntheses feed your imagination. But the artifact is what gives the world the ability to find you. The artifact is what allows other people to discover that the weaver they were looking for has existed all along. Without at least 1 artifact per year, the pattern weaver mind eats itself. It loops endlessly through new threads without ever putting one through the loom hard enough to produce cloth. The guilt that creates is real, and it is not solved by reframing. It is solved by shipping. So as you do your loom audit, ask one final question. What is the 1 artifact I am going to commit to finishing this year? Not 3. 1. Choose it carefully. Synthesis. Then protect that artifact like it's the only thing on your calendar, because in a real sense it is. Concept finishes will accumulate naturally. Shelf finishes will happen whether you plan them or not. Syntheses will reveal themselves when you do the audit. The artifact is the only finish line that requires deliberate, scheduled, protected commitment. So commit. That is the whole framework. 4 finish lines. 1 audit. 1 artifact per year. Everything else takes care of itself. Let me close with the thing I most want you to walk away believing. The graveyard you've been hauling around since you were a teenager is not a graveyard. It never was. The half-finished book on your nightstand is a concept finish wearing the wrong label. The course you dropped is a shelf finish waiting for the right trigger. The 3 obsessions that haunt you are a synthesis whispering at you to put them together. And the one thing you've been afraid to actually ship is almost certainly the artifact your loom has been preparing you to make all along. You were never behind. You were never broken. You just had the wrong definition of done. If this gave you a way out of the guilt, do me a favor. Subscribe! The Pattern Weaver community is growing, and this is exactly the kind of work we're going to keep doing together. And in the comments, I want to hear from you. Tell me one project from your graveyard that you now realize was actually a concept finish or a shelf finish in disguise. And if you can spot a synthesist hiding in 3 of your old threads, drop that too. The community is going to help you see things you can't see yet. Thank you for watching. Now go open the notebook. Your loom has been weighing.